Hey, Dr. Fenn.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Sure can.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to present today. I always have a little bit of kind of imposter syndrome when I'm talking to GIS professionals because I'm a geographer, but I'm not a GIS professional. I use GIS, especially kind of geographic visualization and some light spatial analysis, to try to better understand how historical housing policies, especially, kind of reverberate through the present. So I hope you'll forgive me if my maps and my analysis is a little bit rudimentary. But I hope we can kind of look and see the bigger picture here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can folks confirm that my screen is being shared? Does that look good?
Yeah, yes. Got it. Everything looks great.
Outstanding. So let me just get right into it then, and we can. Probably a lot of us have recently seen either this exact story or some kind of similar story of an African-American homeowner getting a significantly lower appraisal in their home and then restaging their house as if it's a house owned by a white person. And like maybe having a friend come over and get a second or a third appraisal, and the home value significantly increases. And I start here because this is kind of an individual data point that looks at the intersection of race and home values in the US. But when we zoom out from the individual to the macro, if you just make a simple scatter plot, for example, of median home value on the y-axis and percent white or percent African-American on the x-axis, and look at every single urban and suburban census tract in the US, what you see is that there's a fairly strong positive correlation between whiteness and home values. And in fact, this correlation would be a lot stronger if when we looked at, let me see if I can get on my, it's not going to work. Let me, forgive me. This correlation would look even stronger if it weren't for the census's top coding of median home value at the 2 million mark. There's about 200 or 300 census tracts with home values in that top coded range. And so that positive correlation between whiteness and median home value would be even stronger than what you're seeing. And when you add on to that percent African-American by median home value, what you see is a fairly strong negative correlation. And I reran these analyses for the state of Ohio. And what you can see again is a strong and very statistically significant positive correlation between percent white by census tract and median home value. And then the same in reverse is a strong and statistically significant negative correlation between percent African-American and home value. And when you zoom into Cuyahoga County, it's amplified even further. And when you're, so let me just put this data out there and visualize it for you so that you can see that. And as a geographer, I'm particularly interested not just in how these data look on a scatter plot, but how these data look geographically. What are the geographic patterns to this data? And I think, unfortunately, this map has gone away, the racial dot map. This is based on the 2010 census. And it's no longer live, but I managed to get a couple of screen captures before. And what you can see on this map is that there is a fairly profound geography to race in the US. And so this is a map with 1 dot per person in the entire US. If you zoom in, for example, to New York City, when we think of New York, at least when I think of New York, I think of a kind of a real metropolitan, diverse, multicultural, multiracial city. But what this map shows is that at the end of any day, when folks go home to the apartments and homes, those apartments and homes that they go home to are on city blocks and in neighborhoods that are largely populated by other people of the same race and ethnicity. This pattern repeats itself, for example, in Chicago, one of the most segregated cities, statistically speaking, one of the most segregated cities in the country. It repeats itself in Detroit with the kind of infamous 8-mile road that divides the city of Detroit from the overwhelmingly white Macomb County to the north, and so on. It repeats in city after city after city. And so really the animating questions of my research over the last 4 or 5 years have kind of been threefold. And I'm going to talk about all three of these today. And those questions are: one, where did this come from? Is it just an accident? Is it a coincidence that this racial geography looks so incredibly consistent city after? It can't possibly be an accident. It can't possibly be coincidence. Where did this landscape of racial inequality come from? The second question that I kind of going to focus on mostly today is: what are the present day impacts? So we talk about segregationist housing policy as policies that were really largely in effect from the late 1800s into the mid to late 1900s. And here we are, more than 50 years on from the Fair Housing Act. Why are we still talking about this? What are the ongoing impacts in the present day of our history of discriminatory housing policies? And then the third question, it's a vast question. Where do we go from here? And I've tried to, for today's talk, to think this through, in particular for GIS professionals working in lots of different areas, in lots of different fields, but kind of thinking it through, like, how are we individually implicated in our workforce, in our workspaces? How are we implicated in trying to rectify and solve this situation? So before I go any further, let me recognize my research team. I teach at a primarily undergraduate institution, so I have a largely undergraduate research team. These three have been working with me for the last 3 years: Jakira, Dominique, and Asia. They're not on the call today, but I do like to recognize them anyway. They've all graduated and on to bigger and better things. And I will try to, throughout my talk today, highlight areas of this project that they've especially worked on. Now, let's answer all these three questions kind of one at a time. One, where did this come from? And like I said before, kind of spoiler alert, it's not an accident. These lines, these landscapes of racial inequality were actively and intentionally produced through both governmental policies and also through the practices of realtors and banks and other financial institutions and urban planners and zoning boards. And so let's look at kind of some of these policies and practices. So on my opening slide, I showed this that's colloquially called a redlining map. It's a map that was made in 1940 in the case of Cuyahoga County. By the federal government in the height of the Great Depression. Data collection started and these maps were made to try, they're called residential security maps. And these maps were made during the Great Depression to try to help homeowners save their homes from foreclosure. And so government workers that were called raters went out neighborhood by neighborhood in kind of graded or rated neighborhoods for their security. And security not in terms of crime, but their security in terms of the federal government investing dollars to help homeowners save their homes from foreclosure. And so what they did is they went neighborhood by neighborhood and said, these are the best neighborhoods in green. The A grade neighborhoods were the most deserving of mortgage assistance. In blue was B grade neighborhoods. In yellow was the third grade neighborhoods, and red on the map, the D grade neighborhoods, the least qualified for mortgage assistance. They were oftentimes called hazardous neighborhoods, hazardous from the point of view of the federal government investing dollars. And in every single one of these neighborhoods, and there's over 200 neighborhoods mapped on this one single map of Cuyahoga County. There's extensive data that the government collected, the government raters collected, quantitative data, including the percent foreign and the percent African American, and then a detailed qualitative description of the characteristics of the area. So you can see this is the neighborhood A22 on the map. And you can see you can read in more detail here what the government raiders had to say about these particular neighborhoods in that area. Or just a few blocks away, D21 on the map, and let me zoom in a little bit here from this data sheet. It was noted that it was this neighborhood was 55% African-American, 35% immigrant or foreign in this, or international. And then they have a description of this area that what you can see here, and the reason that I've blown this up for us, is that we can see how central race was to the way that neighborhoods were rated. In fact, in all of the 200 and something neighborhoods in Cuyahoga County that were rated on this redlining map, precisely 0 of them, of the neighborhoods that were not redlined, of the neighborhoods that got the highest grades, green, blue, and yellow, not one single one of those neighborhoods had an African-American population above 5%. On the other hand, of the neighborhoods that were redlined, nearly all of them were either majority Black or majority foreign. And I want to switch gears. This is from the Cuyahoga County redlining map. I want to switch gears just for a second to an analysis that I did with one of my research assistants, with Dominique, of a qualitative textual analysis of the Norfolk redlining map. And Norfolk is the city where I'm based. And after reading through the 200 and some odd data sheets from the Cuyahoga County, our analysis from the Norfolk redlining map, it really parallels what you can see in the data sheets for the Cuyahoga County redlining map. And that is basically that the highest rated neighborhoods, that there was a lot of talk about sound construction, about pride of home ownership, about stable population, and about amenities, whether those are environmental amenities like green spaces and parks, or whether those are about kind of city services, paved roads, lighting, a country club, good schools, the presence of churches, and so on. And so you see in these A-rated neighborhoods talking not just about a good, quote unquote, a good population that exhibits high levels of pride of home ownership, but also there's a lot of talk that points to investments in these neighborhoods in the form of city services. On the other hand, redlined neighborhoods, what you can see is that there's talk of a lack of pride of home ownership. There's a strong presence of race and overtly racialized, let's say, language here. And then also evidence of already a lack of investment by municipalities in these neighborhoods, of the lack of hard surface streets, the presence of dirt streets, of ruts and mud holes, and also significant discussion of environmental hazards, of industrial sites, of flooding in some cases. And so what we can see is like how both environment, health, investments and disinvestments, and race play out. And what we know is that overwhelmingly, redlined neighborhoods were predominantly African-American or predominantly quote unquote foreign, while neighborhoods that escaped redlining were overwhelmingly white. And this was the case in Norfolk, this is the case in Cuyahoga County, and this is the case in over 250 cities around the country that were redlined in this era. So this is one example of a federal housing policy through the homeowners, the HOLC, the predecessor to the FHA, of intentionally investing in white neighborhoods during the Great Depression and intentionally disinvesting in non-white neighborhoods through housing at the same time. Now, if you fast forward a decade or so to the aftermath of World War II, if we place ourselves historically, we'll know that during the Depression and then during the World War, two things were happening in terms of housing and households. One is that very little new home construction was happening for that 15-year period from about 1930 to about 1945. And at the same time, as is the case fairly universally, Birth rates decline during economic recessions and depressions, and they also decline during major armed conflicts. And so during this 15-year period of 1930 to 1945, there were very few new housing starts nationally, and also lower than normal birth rates, which follows, of course, as we know, in 1946, the beginning of the baby boom, with this significantly heightened birth rates. And because there had been no new housing built for the previous 15 years, very soon thereafter, a real serious housing crisis in the US, a housing shortage that resulted in a couple of different federal policies to try to build out more housing in the urban and suburban areas of the US. One of them is the expansion of public housing. But public housing changed really significantly after World War II and was starting in about 1945. Public housing was largely built in inner city, formerly redlined neighborhoods. It was nearly universally segregated Black. And as we know now with hindsight, these redlined neighborhoods, or in the 1940s and 1950s, this is the soon-to-be kind of deindustrializing urban core of cities all over the country. And so we have housing policy that's kind of geared towards building public housing for African-American and other non-white families in the urban core of cities. And at the same time, through the FHA was financing the build out of the American suburb. And we frequently hear about the kind of this great suburbanization that was happening starting in the 1940s, but especially kind of 1940s through the late 1960s or early 1970s. And we talk about this in terms of white flight. We hear a lot about white flight. White families picked up from the urban core with the growing middle class, moved out to the suburbs to get a little bit bigger of a house, have a little bit more land. But what is missing from that story is that William Levitt, the guy who developed Levittown, New York, there's actually 7 Levittowns in the US, all designed and built by this developer, William Levitt, and his development company. He couldn't have afforded to build 18,000 homes on Long Island without significant credit. And he got that credit from the FHA, from the Federal Housing Administration. And the FHA, as a term for providing this financing to William Levitt, required that every single house in this development contained what's called a racially restrictive covenant. This is an example from earlier in the 20th century of a racially restrictive covenant. That this says, for example, that for a period of 20 years from August the 1st, 1909, in this case, the said property shall not be sold, leased, given, or devised to a person of African descent or to a corporation, a majority of whose stock is owned or controlled by persons of African descent. And what we see the presence of these racially restrictive covenants as early as the 1880s, but they really take off. The use of these really expands significantly beginning in the 19-teens and expanding through the 20s, a lull of all home building in the 1930s, and these come back in force in the 1940s until they're finally declared unconstitutional and thus unenforceable, but not until the 1950s is when the Supreme Court weighed in on these. So we have a period of nearly 70 years where the suburbanization of the American city is, because of federal housing policy. It's not just random that white folks, rather than people of other races, picked up and moved to the suburbs. People who weren't white were explicitly prohibited from doing so. There's a project out of the University of Minnesota that has tracked and mapped nearly 100,000 racially restrictive covenants just in the city of Minneapolis. And it gives a sense of how widespread the use of these racially restrictive covenants were. So I've covered a bit of history here. If you come and take my urban geography course, we spend a lot more time kind of in the detail of this urban history. But the bottom line is that through redlining, through public housing policy, through racially restrictive covenants, we haven't even mentioned exclusionary zoning, of the discriminatory lending practices of banks and financial institutions, racial steering by realtors, highway construction in the same period. What we have is effectively the long-term disinvestment in Black and Brown communities all over the country. And so this right here, what you're seeing on this screen right now, this is what is the kind of the causal driving forces that help explain those scatter plots at the beginning of the talk. Now, if we want to move from history to the present day, we have to think about, okay, so what are the impacts in the present day? And I want to talk about both the macro kind of structural impacts, but also before the pandemic, for about 2 years before the pandemic, my research team and I spent a lot of time talking to individuals, interviewing folks, taking oral histories, and also providing cameras to our participant photographers to take pictures of places that were meaningful to them so that we could try to better understand the human experience of living in racially segregated neighborhoods in the present day. So I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the data and the maps and the macro structural. So I want to take just a moment to show you 3 or 4 of these images that really get the images taken by our participant photographers that really highlight the embodied individual human impact of this history. So let me show you, these are all from the Hampton Roads region in Virginia. This is where we've been carrying out this research. But as we've seen and we will continue to see, the trends are national. And so what we see playing out in Hampton Roads is the local manifestation of these national trends. So I'm not going to read the captions. I'll just show you the pictures and I'll let you read short excerpts from interviews that we conducted with our participant photographers. So this, and we have on my project's website, and the link is at the bottom of every page in this slideshow. In my project's website, we have a gallery of several hundred images that our participant photographers have taken. And those are all geolocated on an interactive map, and you're welcome to kind of explore that in more detail. But let me switch gears from the individual, the embodied impact of this history to the macro. Let's zoom out to the macro. And one thing that we know in the US, this is recent data from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, is that there is a racial income gap between the median white family and the median Black family. There's about a 35 to 40% gap in annual income. But that is nothing compared to the racial wealth gap. It's a gap of 90%. The median white family in the US, and as I'm sure we all know what the median is, it just means that half of white families have more wealth, half of white families have less wealth. The family that's right in the middle has about $171,000 of net worth. And that is mostly derived from the one home that the median wealth, in terms of wealth, the median family owns and lives in. It's not from a vast stock portfolio. It's not from second and third and fourth homes and yachts and commercial properties. The median family's wealth is largely derived from the one home that they own and live in and occupy. And the median African-American family in the US has 1/10 that wealth. This wealth gap is the result of nearly a century of overtly and intentionally discriminatory housing policies that invested in home ownership in white neighborhoods. It invested in services in white neighborhoods while disinvesting in Black and other non-white neighborhoods. So let me show you what this looks like on a map. Then I recreated a series of maps to kind of look at how this works geographically in Cuyahoga County in the city of Cleveland, which is where I think most of you all are based. So if we take this 1940 redlining map, what I've done here is side by side on the map shows the same geographic extent. On the left-hand side shows neighborhoods that got the highest 2 rankings on that redlining map. So these are neighborhoods that on the map are green and blue. And on the right-hand side here, this map shows redlined neighborhoods. And then I started overlaying it with contemporary data from the American Community Survey. This is the most recent vintage of data from the ACS that's available. And what you can see is that the lines that were created in the redlining map in 1940 largely are still the lines of the racial geography of the city and the broader county today. So we can see that neighborhoods that were redlined are today majority white, while neighborhoods that escaped redlining are today majority white, while neighborhoods that were redlined are today majority African American. Household incomes are significantly lower in redlined neighborhoods, and the poverty rate is more than double in redlined neighborhoods. The poverty rate today is more than double in neighborhoods that were redlined more than 80 years ago. And what we can see, the driver of wealth is home values. What we can see is that home values are significantly higher in neighborhoods that escaped redlining compared to neighborhoods that were redlined. And this is the driver of the middle class wealth in the U.S. is home ownership. And then we have this situation in the U.S. where we fund our schools based on property taxes and we populate our schools based on neighborhood. And so it really should be no surprise to anyone that if we spend nearly a century disinvesting in Black properties in Black neighborhoods, that and then we fund our schools based on property values, that there's a $23 billion per year racial funding gap. And the second paragraph here is important. Overwhelmingly white school districts receive $23 billion more per year than predominantly non-white school districts in state and local funding, despite serving roughly the same number of children. And so what we see here is our history of discriminatory housing policies has a present day impact on home values and on wealth, and has a lasting impact through this differential in school funding for kids from neighborhoods that were 80 years ago redlined. There's also a lot of new research in the last, let's say, 5, 6, 7 years coming out that are tying these historical practices, these discriminatory practices from our past, to environmental and health inequality in the present. So one recent study looked at the combination of tree canopy and pavement. And what you can see here is that neighborhoods that escaped redlining have a lot more trees. Neighborhoods that were redlined have a lot fewer trees. And on the flip side, Neighborhoods that were redlined have significantly more pavement. And as a result, a study that just came out in 2020 in the journal Climate shows that in a survey of 108 different cities that were redlined, redlined neighborhoods are significantly hotter on summer afternoons than neighborhoods that escaped redlining. In Cleveland specifically, neighborhoods that were redlined are about 5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than neighborhoods, in some cases, neighborhoods just a couple of blocks away that received the highest rankings on that redlining map. And if we know that the population that lives within these redlined neighborhoods is higher poverty, more likely to be renters than homeowners, more likely to have substandard windows, to have substandard insulation, to have inefficient window unit air conditioning, this 5 degrees of difference in the context of climate change, in the context of rising and extensive heat events, this 5 degrees difference can transfer to significant health inequalities for populations that live in formerly redlined neighborhoods. I want to show just a couple of more maps before we get to thinking through where do we go from here. And so let me zoom out to nearly the entire county. And I want to kind of get to this idea of the cumulative impact. I've already showed you the maps of race, of income, of poverty, of home values, of trees, of imperviousness, of heat. But let's add on a few more layers onto this map. So here's this is at the census tract level, percent African American. If we kind of zoom in, focus in on redlined neighborhoods in Cleveland and the broader Cuyahoga County. Let's add to this map toxic release inventory sites. These are, if you ran the spatial statistics on it, these are over-concentrated in formerly redlined high minority neighborhoods. You can add on to this interstate highways, study after study after study, including a very recent study in the Vanderbilt Law Review just published last year in 2021, traces how interstate highways were intentionally built through majority Black and majority non-white, frequently formerly redlined neighborhoods. And you can see kind of the geography of public housing, where public housing near universally was built in formerly redlined majority Black neighborhoods and segregated Black during the 1940s and 1950s. And so you can see, and we could add much more data onto this map. And in fact, there's a really compelling, I'm sure you all have used EJ Screen, the EPA's kind of environmental justice mapping. If we took data from EJ Screen, we would see this process repeat itself as the cumulative impacts on predominantly non-white, high poverty, formerly redlined neighborhoods. Like the literature on environmental justice would tell us, the most marginalized communities bear the brunt of these environmental impacts. And I should say, this also has all of these things that we're talking about, whether it's socioeconomics, home value, education, environments. These are what public health officials talk about as the social determinants of health, including, for example, a lack of health insurance. And these have very real health outcomes. And so if you look here, the same map, this is the population without health insurance, is the same population that is more likely to be in poverty, is the same population that lives in neighborhoods that are hotter on the summer afternoon, more likely the same population that's in closer proximity to interstate highways. This is the same population that has heightened asthma rates. And when you get right down to it, this is the same population that has a significantly lower life expectancy. And when I ran the analysis here in Cuyahoga County, neighborhoods that were redlined more than 80 years ago have on average life expectancy that's 6 years lower than neighborhoods that escaped redlining. This is a 6-year penalty on populations that are born and raised in formerly redlined neighborhoods. And when you zoom in, and I don't know Cleveland well, I don't know the area, I haven't visited, I actually have never been in Cleveland, so I can only look at this from kind of the view from above. So I don't know it, but I did look for a couple of places where there are really significant juxtapositions. And if we zoom in to this area near central Cleveland, and I want to look and this is right on the border between the city, as I'm sure you all know, right on the border of the city and the county. And we add in all those cumulative impacts of redlining, of public housing, of toxic release inventory sites, of interstate highways. When you get right down to it, this census tract has the population in this census tract has a life expectancy of 81 years. And just the census tract immediately adjacent to the west, life expectancy drops by over 15 years. And so, like, this is, in a single slide, I think this shows you why our history of discriminatory housing policies and practices absolutely are still relevant to discussions about geography, about urban planning in the present day. And I think, for me at least, this really tells us that we need to think about how, if we're working in fields of local government, of urban planning, if we're using our tools of geographic information systems and geographic information science, our work is upon landscapes of deep inequality. That is, our canvas upon which we work is already a landscape. I should say, the landscape on which we work is already a landscape of really profound inequality. And so what we do now, looking into the future, is building upon this landscape of inequality. And so the neutral position, that is the position of ignoring existing inequalities in the material urban landscape, the objective or neutral position actually has the perverse outcome of exacerbating those inequalities. And the way to build towards a more equitable future is to take into account the fact that intentionally discriminatory housing policies and other policies of our past built the landscape that we occupy in the present, and we have to contend with it moving into the future. So where do we go from here? I don't have so much as answers to this question as further questions for us and for you all to think about as you move forward, as we move forward in our work into the future. Where do we go from here? And I'm going to put this one slide up. Well, we're about to spend, and we have started spending, a whole lot of infrastructure money. That is money largely in urban areas of rebuilding or building new infrastructure in highly populated areas. And in the context that I live in Southeastern Virginia, the broader context of climate change and sea level rise is very, very real, as we're already facing significant impacts from sea level rise. And so a lot of the infrastructure spending that's happening in the city of Norfolk is being spent to make the city more resilient to sea level rise related flooding. And I put these two images, these two screenshots up side by side to think through kind of this question: how can we work intentionally to construct more racially and socially just landscapes in the future in the context of this infrastructure build out, in the context of climate change, and the need to make our cities more resilient to the impacts of climate change? And so I want to ask, I basically, rather than giving answers here, I have three questions for us to kind of put in the back of our mind and think about as we move out into the world. One is, how can we correct for the historical and intentional devaluation of Black and brown properties and neighborhoods? I can't get this side-by-side graphic of a 90% racial wealth gap and how it looks geographically on the map. I can't get this out of my head. And in the context of Norfolk, this is really, really important, because the city of Norfolk is spending billions of dollars on the one hand to protect some neighborhoods from the impacts of sea level rise. They're building seawalls, they're putting in gigantic pump stations, they're protecting some neighborhoods. And at the same time, they're beginning to contend with the fact that there's going to have to be managed retreat from coastal properties in some places. And that's going to require what we call buyouts. That is, buying out property owners in order to allow them to move elsewhere, and that those parcels then are turned into wetlands that help to provide a buffer to the rest of the city. But what we see here, and we're already seeing this play out in Norfolk, there's studies recently published on this in the city of Philadelphia and on the city of Baltimore that track where these dollars get spent and how these dollars get spent. What we see, and is already starting to happen in Norfolk, is because of a century of discriminatory housing policies that invested in white neighborhoods, today those white neighborhoods have higher property values. And from an economically rational perspective that doesn't take into account the history of discriminatory policies, from an economically rational, quote unquote, race neutral perspective, properties that have higher values should be protected, but those properties, because of the historical inequities, are predominantly white. And on the other hand, properties that are, you get more bang for your buck. If you're from the city's perspective, you get more bang for your buck by buying out lower valued properties. And so what we see is that protective infrastructure is concentrated around predominantly white neighborhoods, and buyouts and displacements are disproportionately impacting non-white communities. How can we deal with this? How can we correct for the historical and intentional devaluation of Black and brown properties and neighborhoods in the context of this build out of infrastructure, in the context of climate change, and all the different local contexts that we all operate in? I don't have the answer to this question, but I think we have to contend with the question. Question number two that I think we need to contend with is, how can we ensure that benefits of future development don't disproportionately flow to white communities while their burdens disproportionately impact communities of color? I don't know the answer to this question, but I have been inspired by what's happening in King County, the county that encompasses the city of Seattle. And just like most of us have probably been somehow connected to some kind of environmental impact study, King County has implemented a policy by which they use equity impact reviews and equity impact studies to understand how zoning changes, to understand how infrastructure, highway construction, how all these different things will impact not just environments, but also impact racial equity in the city of Seattle and in King County more broadly. My third and final question before I conclude is how can we account for the cumulative socioeconomic, environmental, and health impacts of past discriminatory policies and practices? And this is another one of those maps. I know from a cartographic perspective, it's a bit of a mess, but I can't get beyond these kinds of maps. And in my own context, in the context of Hampton Roads, of the city of Norfolk, this map is essentially the same. Of the redlined neighborhoods is where the toxic release plants are put, it's where the highways are, where the public housing is. And then in my own context, in Norfolk, just a couple of months ago, the state approved new permits for a new natural gas fired power plant that's going to go in right in the heart of all these redlined neighborhoods, already with 15 to 17 year lower life expectancies, already with higher rates of asthma. And they're taking it and why anybody is building a new natural gas fired power plant in the 21st century is beyond me anyway, but putting it again right on top of the location that has been bearing the brunt of these environmental and socioeconomic burdens for over a century. So I think like I said before, I don't have the answer to where we go from here, but I think that answer needs to include, sorry, I missed my slide, needs to include dealing with the correcting for historical devaluations. It needs to think in the future about not perpetuating environmental injustices, and it needs to take seriously into consideration these cumulative impacts. So with that, I will conclude. I will thank you very much for your attention, and I would love to, if there are comments, if there are questions, thoughts to share. I'm not sure technologically how it works here in our webinar format, but I would love to hear your feedback.
So, Dr. Finn, can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, let me thank you very much for keynoting our symposium today and actually taking the time to do this analysis in our area, making it very relevant to us. That I think is very powerful as well. We do have some folks that in the chat area have posted some questions. Here's what I will do. I believe that if everybody looks in their panel, there is an area where you can raise your hand, and when you raise your hand, if you want to, I can actually bring you, allow you to address Dr. Fenn directly, and if not, then I will just read from the chat. So everybody, if anybody sees that hand and wants to throw it up, and in the meantime, while we're waiting for that to happen, I think the first comment that I see here is really from Mark Salling, Dr. Mark Salling, and it's about the GIS Code of Ethics, very relevant to your presentation. So that was more of a comment. You know, how GIS practitioners is related to his research. Nancy von Meyer, Dr. Nancy von Meyer, has there been any analysis on the title issues around these red line areas? In places where I have seen the pattern he is describing, we have also found many parcels with confused or uncertain title due to unrecorded transactions and inheritance issues. Is that a common feature of these areas?
You know, I in my university classes, I always try to avoid just copying to the fact that I don't know. But in this case, I'll say I don't know if there has even been kind of macro level systematic study of this area of this issue. Certainly, I know from a anecdotal perspective, this is absolutely an issue, and I suspect that if it were to be studied systematically, we would find that. But I can't speak to that specifically because I don't know of like I said, I don't know of specific systematic research that's been done on that. And I would love if you do, Dr. Meyer, know of that. I'd love to see that.
The next question here is related to wealth. What is considered wealth, with more, I guess, specifics as to what defines wealth?
Yeah, sure. And I'll combine that, if I may, with a question about if the wealth gap is connected to level of education. More jobs equals more wealth. Excuse me, better jobs equals more wealth. Oops. Should I don't know why is my screen shared? Did that disappear?
Yes. No, I see your screen's still on. I see a road.
Oh, yeah. You see a picture from the
Badlands.
It's from the Painted Desert.
Painted Desert. Okay.
Anyway, so wealth is basically when the difference between income and wealth. Income is like your salary, what you make in a year, or what you make per hour, or whatever. And wealth is the combined value of all of your assets, subtracting out all of your debts. And so it's basically wealth is your net worth. And the middle class net worth in the U.S. is largely constituted by the equity in their home, and then a smaller amount of wealth is also in kind of employer-based retirement savings. But the single most important driver of middle class wealth in the U.S. is home equity, and so there actually has been research to Marcia Wolf's question. There actually about the question is, was the wealth gap connected with level of education? Better jobs equals more wealth. Let me go back to this graphic. Let me see if I can find it here to kind of get at that. This one right here. There is an income gap, and if the income gap, and we do use our income to build wealth. We do use our income to pay our home mortgages. And so there is an income gap, and there's complex reasons for this income gap that are also based in kind of partly in kind of structural racism. But if there is a 40% income gap, and if income was the only driver of wealth, we would expect to see a 40% wealth gap. But there's more to it. And so what explains the difference between the 40% income gap and the 90% wealth gap, that difference, that expansion of the gap when you move from income to wealth, that is what is explained almost exclusively by the long-term impacts of discriminatory housing policies. There was a really great study done a couple of years ago that tested statistically all kinds of other data to see if there were other factors at play in driving this wealth gap, including education levels, including single-headed households versus dual-headed households, all these different factors. And when they test this out statistically, none of those other factors, including education, can explain this gap. Really, and I can point you to the paper. The paper is called the Asset Value of Whiteness. And if you just Google the asset value of whiteness, you can see this. It's a peer-reviewed paper that really shows that there is no other explanation that can get us to this 90% wealth gap in light of only a 40% income gap, other than the historical impacts of discriminatory housing policies.
Outstanding. Another question here is, after all the research completed so far, do you see discriminatory housing increasing in the future?
Yeah, so we did pass the Fair Housing Act. It was the third major civil rights legislation in 1968, and so technically speaking, like, housing discrimination is illegal, and the policies of redlining and of segregated public housing and all these kinds of things are technically illegal. But what we still continue to see is really, really widespread discrimination, both at the individual level. There's study after study after study shows that, for example, landlords continue to discriminate against non-white tenants, all the way out to the macro, where every single major bank in the US in the last 10 or 15 years, JP Chase, Bank of America, all these banks, they've all had to settle massive class action lawsuits for recent discriminatory lending policies where they give significantly higher, there's a practice of giving significantly higher interest rates to either non-white mortgage borrowers or to people who are buying homes in predominantly non-white neighborhoods. And so JP Chase recently settled in the hundreds of millions of dollars a class action lawsuit for the discriminatory policies. And so we do see, on the one hand, the continuation of discrimination, but I also, and not to mention my opening slide all the way back at the beginning of my presentation, well, I'm not able to navigate to it right now, with the discrimination and in appraisals. So we see, on the one hand, these kinds of things happening in spite of the fact that laws have been passed that make those kinds of things technically illegal.
Okay, actually there's I will let everybody read the Mark Saling comment, about the GIS Code of Ethics again. Joe Mylan, excellent presentation. I live in a red line neighborhood in a house built in 1890. If you want any perspective, so Joe here at our county is available to give perspective. Mark Roblowski, has property ownership been considered as a factor? Urban areas seem to be trending to be rental-based properties.
Yeah, but that's true, and it's I mean, part of that is the history of, and I'm going to go to this slide here, of how essentially in the same time period from the post-World War II era up to the early 70s, there was essentially two different kinds of housing policies going on. One, the housing policies surrounding suburbanization, which was almost exclusively for white families. And through this suburbanization, homes in Levittown, I didn't get quite into the weeds of it here, but homes in Levittown, when Levittown was built in 1947, each of these homes cost about twice national median income. And today, those homes are worth more than 10 times national median income. So in the 1940s and 1950s, these suburban homes were affordable to working class folks, but only white working class folks were allowed to buy them. And then on the flip side, the government was spending money, admittedly spending money, to build out public housing. But when you live in public housing, unlike when the government subsidizes suburban home ownership for you, when the government subsidizes public housing for non-white folks, that is, public housing is not a wealth builder. And so, and for that matter, modern day Section 8 housing or rental assistance, this is also not a wealth builder for the tenant. It's a wealth builder for the landlord. And so we do see higher levels of rentership, but that also is at least partially the result of the history of these discriminatory policies.
Let's see here. How does gentrification fit within this, and how do we balance shifting property values with existing residents' needs?
Yeah, this is a huge area of research. It's a huge area of controversy. The context of gentrification, of course, is gentrification is kind of loosely defined as mostly white, younger than average, well-educated folks moving back into the formerly disinvested inner city core. And so gentrification, from a housing perspective, gentrification oftentimes drives displacement. On the one hand, if we're looking at the urban core, of course it's good for properties and neighborhoods that have been disinvested in now to be receiving investments, to be getting better sidewalks, to be getting better streetlights, to be getting a better housing stock. But what gentrification also drives is it tends to drive displacement. So the population in census tracts that undergo rapid gentrification, like the population may increase, property values may increase, but if you look at it between year 0 and year 10 or year 0 and year 20, the actual individuals who live there will be completely different because of the pressures of displacement. And so because gentrification, it increases the value of property, but it doesn't resolve underlying difficulties of racialized economic inequality. So yeah, gentrification absolutely is a really important part of this story.
We have a little bit of time here left, but let me ask Frank or our next presenter if he could log out and log back in to get to panelists. I would really appreciate that. The next question here is, Jessica Cotton, great information in your analysis. Did you factor in utilities and affording bills into these red line areas?
Yep, I did. I have not in the context of the analyses that I did for Cuyahoga County. I have for my analysis in Hampton Roads, looking specifically looking specifically at what's called the gross rent. And the gross rent includes the cost of rent for an apartment plus the utilities paid by the tenant. And so when you look at gross rent, what you see is, and then that helps you look at what's called rent burden and extreme rent burden. Rent burden is where you spend a household that spends 30% of its income on the gross rent is considered rent burdened, and a household that spends 50% of its income, monthly income, on the gross rent it's considered to be extreme rent burdened. And you do see really tight correlations between formerly redlined neighborhoods and neighborhoods where a higher percentage of the population is in a situation of rent burden or extreme rent burden. So yeah, when you look at all that together, that's certainly those spatial patterns certainly hold true.
I think we have time for one more question, and then for anybody else that has questions, please put them in chat. If Dr. Finn could stick around, maybe he can answer some questions that are put into the chat window after he's sure. done here. Yeah, sure. But the last question that I'll ask is, how large of an impact do you think the recent influx of investment firms into the real estate market will be, and will this simply perpetuate the status quo?
This is such an important question. I think we're about to see a lot of more research on this. A good friend and colleague of mine here in Hampton Roads has recently been tracking, in the context of Norfolk, has been tracking how the extent to which financial firms are purchasing, especially what are classified as affordable housing units and multi-unit structures. And so what we're seeing is that like when we think of financial firms purchasing housing, if you think of like the context in New York City, you think of buying the kind of in the luxury markets, right? Investors buying property in the luxury markets. And what we're seeing more and more is investment firms, hedge funds, financial institutions are purchasing housing in the affordable markets, in the lower and middle income rental markets, which absolutely is one of the factors driving up rental costs across the country and creating, And I pose this question to my urban geography students kind of as a theoretical or almost philosophical question, but like, what is a city for? And from the perspective of finance, a city and the properties in cities, the purpose of them is to create returns, profitable returns on investments. And that interest of a financial institution investing in affordable housing goes directly contrary to kind of the answer to the question of what is a city for from the perspective of a low or middle income resident, right? And so what we absolutely are seeing the kind of the financialization of affordable housing is most certainly expanding for one, and exacerbating the kind of the present day crisis of affordable housing that we see in the US. But listen, I know we're up on the end of my time. I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to talk and to take your questions. I'm going to drop in the chat right now my email address, and I would love to hear from folks, to hear of your experiences, to know of the work that you all are doing, to answer any further questions. So please do feel free to reach out to me. And Tom, thanks so much for the invitation.
No, well, thank you, Johnny, and I know, Dr. Fenn, I know that you can't hear the applause, so let me do that for everybody that's on the webinar here. Very, very thought-provoking. You've given us all a lot to think about heading into the long weekend, so we really do appreciate you spending the time with us today on this very and I think many people will agree with me, a very important topic, very timely. So thank you again, Dr. Fenn, and have a wonderful long weekend. And Dr. Fenn, thank you for providing your email address. And we do look like we have maybe a couple more questions popping up in the chat. So without delaying any further,